This is Tao Unbound, the English language podcast of Tel Aviv University. Please welcome your host, Ido Aharoni, Tel Aviv University's graduate, member of the Board of Governors, lecturer, writer, and veteran diplomat.
Welcome to yet another episode of Tao Unbound. I'm Ido Aharoni, your host, and it is my pleasure to host today a very special guest, Professor Uriel Abulof. Welcome to our studio.
Thank you.
You are such a prolific researcher and writer. I read about you so much before today, and I was blown away by the scope of your work. So you are an associate professor of political science at Tel Aviv University. You're also a research fellow at the Truman Institute, the Hebrew U, and you also teach at Cornell.
Right.
And I'll ask you about that because of at least the perception in Israel today that Israel is rather isolated in American academia, which I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. Professor Abulof's specialty, and listen to this well, is the politics of fear. And he also is interested in happiness and hope, legitimation, social movements, nationalism, and ethnic conflicts. He wrote several books, most notably in 2015, The Mortality and Morality of Nations. That's an interesting one. What is the morality of nations?
The Mortality and Morality of Nations.
And the mortality of... And then, again in 2015, Living on the Edge, The Existential Uncertainty of Zionism, which is a big part of our conversation today. But before any of that, tell us about yourself.
I don't know how to do that. I mean, the whole sort of elevator pitch that people often request.
So you live in Jerusalem. Let's start with that.
I live in Jerusalem, and I think that in many ways I am a Jerusalemite. If there is any sort of identity tag that I should tag along with, it would be Jerusalem.
And your family originally came from a region known as Bukhara?
Well, I had both Iraqi and Bukhari origins. My mother came from Iraq. She was actually born in Iraq. And my father was born in Israel, but his father was born in Bukhara.
So, and your father grew up in the Bukharan quarter in Jerusalem, or?
In Jerusalem, but not in the quarter itself, in Beit Vagan.
In Beit Vagan. Okay, so that's one of the best neighborhoods in Jerusalem. So you grew up in Beit Vagan.
No. This is where my father grew up in. I was mostly in the Katamonim.
Okay.
This is where my parents are still live. And now we're in the French Hill.
Okay. So you're a Jerusalemite.
But throughout Jerusalem, yeah, in one way or another.
And I think it's relevant to our discussion, the distinction that many Israelis do between what Jerusalem represents as a state of mind as opposed to what Tel Aviv represents as a state of mind. And we can talk about the tension between the two, but you're a bridge, you're a living bridge between those two places, right? You live in Jerusalem, you teach in Tel Aviv, and I'm the same way, by the way. I live in the Jerusalem area, and I work in Tel Aviv.
So back and forth.
Back and forth every day. Yeah. I come to Tel Aviv, but
yeah, same here.
So you got your PhD
at the Hebrew University.
At the Hebrew University,
right?
And what made you think about this area of nations and morality and politics of fear? What was the drive for you to concentrate on that?
Look, if you want to connect it to what you mentioned before, I imagine that Jerusalem is part of that. Because if you live in Jerusalem, this is what you feel constantly. You feel that ongoing fear. You also feel that ongoing tensions between different nations, between different religions. The role of morality is all over the place. What is right? What is wrong? You, in a sense, metaphorically, but also sometimes viscerally, touch sacredness and whatever comes along with that. And it requires, at least for me, some sort of response. What do I do with this? What do I do with that sort of an explosive material that I'm sitting on? And I think throughout my life, there was an ongoing attempt to understand what it means to live on that sort of edge. And I've been trying to figure that out ever since.
And what have you discovered about the human nature? Because in one of the monologues that I read about, that you wrote, actually, in one of your websites, it says that above all, you're interested in the human nature because you talk about politics of fear, you talk about politics of hope. What is it about the human nature? Is there, like, at the end of the road, a basic fundamental plus versus minus?
That's a good question. I don't know if I would frame it necessarily in terms of plus and minuses. There's something unique, I think. And I wouldn't necessarily call it human nature, but rather the human condition. And I think there are several elements that distinguishes us, certain aspects that set us apart and potentially can bring us together as human beings. So if we speak about, for example, the politics of fear, all animals fear. Human and non-human animals fear. There is nothing uniquely human in that. But there is something unique about the way humans, we, fear. For example, one of the greatest object of fear is supposedly death. Now, to a certain extent, all animals fear that, or at least they fear the pain that may be involved in that. But humans are unique in being aware of their own mortality. We know from a fairly young age that we are about to die. From the age of 4, 5, 6, all children somehow grasp that thing. What does it do to us? This is something that I was trying to figure out. Also, importantly, and it's no less important, I think, than the question of fear, is that we are also at a certain point aware that we can choose death. We can commit suicide. Now, this again is a very unique human aspect, as far as we know, obviously. I mean, we might one day learn that dolphins know how to think about death in that way. Presumably not. What does it do to us? The awareness of humans that we are not just mortal, but we can bring on our own death. And so if we keep on living, there is a choice involved in that, even if it's not always an aware choice. The effect of that on our personal life and political life, that fascinates me. And this is, of course, just one aspect, that of fear.
So what you would say, and correct me if I'm wrong. So fear is very natural, almost built in.
Right, as we know the reactions of flight or fight, right? We have it all over the animal kingdom.
Right.
But with humans, there is an edge to that. And that's the edge that fascinates me.
Which makes the politics of hope so much more complex than politics of fear. Am I right?
Right, absolutely. I think that there is something, again, distinctively human about hoping. I don't think that you can say the same about non-human animals or machines, or for that matter, God. Right? God doesn't hope. If God wants something to happen, it happens. With humans, that's obviously not the case. We develop this sort of sensation of something that might happen that I can help bring about, which, by the way, is the distinction between hope and optimism. Okay? This is distinctively human. And the question, of course, where does it come from? What does it do to us? And what we can do with it, or should do with it.
Now, I read several years ago a book that is by now, I think, a classic called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt from NYU, in which he claims that there are 6 moral foundations or moral pillars, and conservative political conversation addresses all of them, while
all
liberal,
the spectrum.
Yeah, while liberal is limited to only 3 or 4 of those pillars, and that's why it's so much more easier for conservative conversation to become popular than liberal conversation. That's
I think he's wrong.
You think is wrong, and tell us why you think is wrong.
I think we can all see that in our daily life and daily politics. I mean, the thought, for example, one of his arguments is that the sentiment of disgust is uniquely conservative because it has something to do with purity. Now, anyone who is involved in politics in one way or another know very well that liberals do often enough feel disgust by various phenomena, including their rivals. There is an element of purity that is very much embedded in that. I don't think that there is anything distinctively conservative about having those sort of emotions. It's there on the human spectrum. It's there on the menu, the human menu.
You mean it's universal, basically, what you're saying?
Overwhelmingly. And obviously there are different approaches to that, from individuals and group perspective, granted. But to say that liberals, in some ways at least, have no access to that sort of emotions, I think is quite...
Now, let's talk about the case of Israel. Historians 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, would look at this period since, I would say, the early 20th century, since the rise of political Zionism, until now, as one long period of war, right? The Zionist movement, from its inception, is in a state of war. May not initiate the war, may be responsive. What does it do to politics?
I'm not sure that war is the right word here. Tension for sure, conflict often enough. War, because we are speaking about large-scale violence, far less so.
I would say a long string of violent inflammations or inflammations of violence.
up and down, up and down. Although if you compare that to other nations in such tensions, in such conflicts, then the current war notwithstanding, and to a certain extent 48, it hasn't been that much of a large-scale violence. In the case of the Israeli-Palestinian, the Israeli-Arab clashes, of course there have been conflicts throughout the history of Zionism. Zionism was a very contentious movement, also within the Jewish people themselves, until today. Typically, it didn't escalate into violence. Now, I think that in some ways the Jewish people throughout history, and certainly the political incarnation of them in the form of the State of Israel, has triggered something from outside that sometimes at least escalated into violence. Zionism was in some ways at least an attempt to respond to that, to the fear that Jews have felt throughout history. And now we will recreate our sovereignty so we will be able to protect ourselves. The extent of success or failure in that endeavor, I think, very much underpins the way that we, Israelis, relate to what we are part of, this grand project, this in some ways grand experiment that we're part of.
Would you say that the centrality of the military experience in Israeli society is a reflection of that?
There is obviously almost no point to speak about sovereignty full-fledged if there is no military component, and considering the enemies of Zionism, military was a necessity. For many people who criticize Zionism from the get-go, that was part of the problem, because the Jewish people in their mind should not be militarized. They are a pacified and should continue to be pacifistic sort of people. The Zionist perspective was, of course, different. But here, I think we should focus on the tension within Zionism itself, in terms of the role of the military, morally speaking. Right? For some, it made sense to speak in terms of might makes right. We are stronger, and that we will be able to force our will onto whomever objects. The other perspective, which was mainstream Zionism, was that in a sense, right makes might. That by the power of our rights, to whatever we're trying to do, which is basically the right of self-determination, we will be able to accumulate enough might, both militarily speaking, but this is just one aspect of might, right? It's also a material in economic sphere, but even more importantly, spiritually. And it's not accident that when Rabin spoke after the 67 war, after the Six-Day War, he greatly emphasized the moral aspects of Jewish life, of Zionism, of the State of Israel. That was always, perhaps up until the last generation, a key aspect in how Israeli Jews saw themselves, and Zionists worldwide.
And now we're facing a new reality, especially on campus in Western countries, especially in the United States, where might is absolutely not right.
Right. The strong is wrong, almost by definition.
By definition.
Right. It's an interesting, I think, development in terms of our moral landscape and the way that it has changed, because it provides, I guess, to a certain extent, a shortcut, which is very useful, mentally speaking. If you have some sort of moral dilemma, or at least potentially moral dilemma, and you want to clarify in your own mind what is right, what is wrong, then balance of power provides a sort of a shortcut. Now I know who is strong, so I know who is wrong. Very straightforward, very simple. And I think in that regard, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and certainly the current war, provides a sort of a lens for many intellectuals, many students, and beyond that, in the West, in order to view Israel as evil incarnated. Now, of course, this is just one aspect of a far larger cultural trends. Part of that is also that Israel is seen as white. So if the strong is wrong, and the strong is, in the identity politics of the day, equivalent to white, Israel is part of that, which is why you would hear less, for example, on atrocities being committed by non-whites, against non-white. That's part of the moral landscape that we are seeing.
Right. The United Nations I just saw a video recently of an exhibit in the lobby of the United Nations building in New York, which I know very well, about the history of terrorism. And there's not even one mention of Palestinian-originated terrorism. Not
That's
PLO,
very interesting.
Not Hamas, not PLO, none of that. Not even the 1972 Olympic game massacre.
Right. What do they do? What do they feature there?
Oh, they feature all sorts of kinds of, the Rohingya and Africa and all sorts of acts of terrorism, but no mention of the Palestinians because, again...
Right, because then it could be depicted as resistance and a righteous resistance as such.
Right.
Because, again, Israel is stronger than the Palestinians, at least, and it is considered white in terms of the overall identity politics of the day.
Now, you're the expert on this, and I'm just curious, maybe you have an answer to that question. Is there a way out of this predicament? Because it's a philosophical predicament. It's like existentialism twisted, that the underdog is always right no matter what.
I think that we are part of that. Many people who object to what we've seen worldwide are part of that. We are partaking in understanding morality through the lens of balance of power. It's simply often enough that we consider ourselves the victims of that. And so by virtue of being victims, we are the righteous ones. But we are basically playing into the hands of those who denounce Israel for the same sort of reasons. And then we just fight.
So explain
who is the bigger victims, right?
Right.
That sort of Olympics we've been accustomed to. But I think we have to release ourselves of those bounds. And this will be hard because that also means that we will have to face squarely all the many moral dilemmas that we should be facing on a daily basis, not least throughout this war. And it also means that we cannot try to hide ourselves behind identity politics. Because we are such and such, for example, because we are Jews, we experience the Holocaust, okay? We experience October 7. And so we are entitled to this, and that. As if by virtue of all of that, we can do whatever we want, especially since the whole world is against us no matter what we do, so we might as well do whatever we want. This mode, which in some ways is very un-Jewish-like, right? There is very little soul-searching that I see, at least in many circles in Israeli society.
Now, what kind of leadership is required to be able to understand that?
It's not a question of leadership. I think that looking for leadership is part of the problem, is not part of the solution. I think that we have continuously been looking up, supposedly, right? We are down below. We're looking up for some leaders to come and save us. This is part of the problem. Leaders will not come and save us, especially not in this generation, which has been, in so many ways, so many of our leaders today have been brought up under the wings of one of the best fearmonger ever, Benjamin Netanyahu. Those leaders will not save us. The question before us is to what extent we can move beyond searching solutions and some of the problems in our leadership, to seeing the problems and the solutions in ourselves, the people. And this is, if I speak of hope, this is where I see hope, in the people, not in leaderships.
And where would the resources to do that come from? I'm thinking about, the need to really, what were you talking about would require education, massive education.
And here I think the academia sometimes betray its mission. Yeah. I mean, take, for example, what we've had throughout the judicial overhaul attempt by the current government. Right, the academia mobilized remarkably well. And I'm very proud of the academia throughout the country of mobilizing in an effort to hold what I consider really an attempt to form here theocratic dictatorship. But that's just one part of it. The other part of it is that the academia has not engaged in any way, in my mind at least, sufficiently with those who look at academia and see it as just a bunch of elitists. We haven't done enough effort in that regard at all. And by the way, this is a worldwide phenomenon. I've seen that in universities worldwide, not least in the US. There too, it's very much an ivory tower. We encase ourselves in that tower and we do not engage enough with the people. And I'm not talking about us going down to the people in order to lecture them about what they should be thinking, right? Coming with some PowerPoint to show them the truth. No, the key to that effort should be listening, first and foremost, and we haven't done that nearly at all. And I think that's in the minds of the current, at least, coalition. That would be the biggest threat of those who are considered and they frame as elitist, will actually engage, converse truly on eyes level with the people whose support they depend on. And I think this is the task of academia these days. And again, worldwide, I think Israel in many ways is microcosmos of that. Which is why I think Israel, if we manage to pull that through under the very harsh circumstances that we're at, we can offer some hope, not just obviously to ourselves, but worldwide.
So as a political scientist, you're saying academia is a big piece of the puzzle,
Yeah.
right? What else needs to happen in order for a society like the Israeli society, which is highly fragmented by virtue of its being a multi-ethnic society, what else needs to happen in order for us to be able to overcome this major hump?
Right. So one of the reasons that I emphasize academia, not just me being here, part of the academia, is the value that I assign to truth. Okay? Academia is one of the custodians of truth, as media is, as the judicial system is. Okay? Our task is to show that there is truth out there. And even if we don't get it completely, which I imagine perhaps we never can, we are on a mission to try and approach it as much as possible. This is something that we should cherish, treasure, and try in conversing with people to show them the value of that and how important it can be, not only for our public life, but personal lives as well. We live in many ways, people have said it before, in post-truth era. And this is the task, I think, that each and every one of us, as citizens, not just as academics, to try and fight against. Otherwise, I think we have little to hope for as human beings.
So I would assume that both of us agree that media has basically neglected its duty to be the custodian of truth a long time ago, especially with the rise of the smartphone in 2007 and the rise of social networks. And the algorithm is actually benefiting
Right.
from pitting us against each other
Absolutely.
and feeding us with all sorts of information oversaturation, information overload, which is my class that I teach here, is about the impact of information overload on society and so on. And so the question is, again, as a political scientist, what can nation states, legislative bodies, what can they do in order to bring back media to that, to become the custodian of truth?
Right. I think that what we see today is a sort of downward spiral of what we used to call agora, right, from ancient Greece, that space of the marketplace of ideas, freely exchanged between people, and the re-rise of the gladiators arena, where, as you said, we pit people against each other. And this is something that greatly benefits, of course, the politicians, who enjoy it tremendously, but also to a certain extent, and we have to be aware of that, it benefits us psychologically. We enjoy that. It's no accident, of course, that we find social media with its algorithm so appealing. It appeals to an important part of us. It's not just the biochemical reactions that it triggers in us, because again, in some ways connecting to what we mentioned before, it's an easy shortcut to avoid the sort of critical reflection that we often enough want to avoid. This is a hard one. Blaise Pascal once says that all humanity's misery comes from one place, a man's inability to sit alone quietly in a room. Because basically, if you do sit alone quietly in a room, you sit with yourself. And this is something that we find very, very hard. Now, this is not unique in any way. This is part of the human condition. But what is unique in our generation is that we always, or almost always, in our days, have a way out of that. We have our, for example, smartphones. And so typically you would not see people just sitting with themselves. If they are occasionally somewhat, even slightly bored, they will pick that one up, right? And that will end. Now, the nature of that boredom is the inner conversation that we have in ourselves. And that terrifies us. And the question, of course, how do you cultivate that? How do you cultivate that inner conversation? How do you cultivate the outer conversation with other people on what is meaningful to us as public, not least in politics? And I think that's part of the process when I, put for a moment my political scientist hat, so to speak, is turning somewhat away from representative democracy to participatory democracy, to direct democracy. I think that our challenge in our days should be to involve the people more and more. To make it more concrete, for example, I'm a great advocate of the usage of civil assemblies, citizens' assembly, and plebiscite, referendums, in order to decide about the key issues on our agenda.
So excellent case studies, Brexit. How would you analyze Brexit? Is it an act of participatory? Because it was a referendum.
Yeah, of course.
And what do you have to say about the outcome?
I think it's a wonderful outcome. And that may come as a sort of a surprise, but I think it is. I think it is for several reasons. One of which is that it showed the rest of the EU community the dangers of Brexit-like movements. So that was an important part of a learning lesson that goes throughout the continent. I would also suppose that if there was another sort of referendum done in the UK a couple of years after Brexit, the result might well have been different. And they didn't account for that, which is, I think, somewhat unfortunate. Now, the way that I see referendums, and that's why I juxtapose it with Citizens' Assembly, is that it should be part of trying to make the people more aware of the current dilemmas that we are facing. The case that I really like is what we have seen in Ireland. For years, there was a question of what to do with the right to have an abortion. Now, in a Catholic society like Ireland, that was almost unthinkable to the leaders that you mentioned before, right? The politicians. Nobody would dare touch it, fearing the consequences of the public. What they've decided to do was Citizen Assembly. Randomly electing, this is an important part, randomly electing, ordinary citizens, 99. They were offered to stay in a hotel for several weekends for open discussions, open debates about that exact matter. And they were those ordinary citizens, who basically invited the experts, such as myself, presumably, to speak before them. Okay? They were calling the shots. So they had the sense that they actually are agents in politics. And they have deliberated that matter for over a month. That paved the path to a referendum in Ireland, where the right of abortion was eventually granted. 2/3 in both the Citizens' Assembly and in that referendum. So that, I think, is very much on the table as a possibility for us politically going forward. Now, most of the misfortunes that we have seen in the West among democracies, slip sliding into autocracies, was not the result of referendums. It was the result of representative democracy. If Germany, before the rise of Nazism, had a referendum on whether or not the ideology of Nazism or Hitler himself were the right for Germany, they would have most certainly lost. They've never gained majority in the parliament. In free and fair election, they never even approached that. But the mechanisms of representative democracy allow them to make that move. Now, I don't want to make too vast of a comparison here, but even if you consider contemporary coalition in Israel, with its sacred 64 seats in the Knesset, if you actually look at the numbers voting for this coalition, they are in minority. Most Israelis voted against this coalition, even in that election. And of course, if we look at the public opinion poll later on, we see where the Israeli public stand.
And I think the same situation exists in the United States with the Electoral College.
Right.
And the fact that Republicans, although occupied the White House many times in the last several decades, haven't won the popular vote in decades in the United States. It's an interesting phenomenon. But you're right. Representative democracy is a recipe for many distortions, and there's a strong argument for participatory politics, especially when we see the rise in what we call participatory culture in general, meaning we view each other as participants, not as passive consumers / clients /
Or at least would
voters.
like to see ourselves as such, yes.
Yes, and I think that there are many opportunities out there when you look at the ability of people to become co-creators of content, the ability of people to express themselves. And so I think this is all playing into what you're talking about.
Right. The question here, of course, is whether we keep our creativity to a sort of a personal bubble in which I may feel good about myself, maybe my family and friends, or do we take it a step further into the public arena? And this, I think, is the challenge that we now face. And the odds are not that great, we should say, because it's not in the best interest of politicians to allow the people to speak in such a way.
Right. So what you're saying is that the fear is that people will self-indulge on the opportunity to be creative rather than be interested or care for the common good or the social interest.
Look, we are all closest to ourselves most. And of course, family and friends, this is our circle. And we've seen it again worldwide. It's not just an Israeli phenomenon. In some ways, Israel is actually an outlier here because the collective is so very much important. But even these days, in the sense of despair that you often see in Israel over the past year and a half, often enough, the result of that is people just retreating, from the public sphere. Sometimes, of course, leaving the country, but retreating into a sort of, okay, at least I will feel okay with myself.
Which begs a question about, because you wrote about the morality of nations. So how do you define the morality of nations, and how do you detect a decline? And are we in a decline?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, first of all, in my analysis of the role of nations, nations provide a sort of a symbolic immortality. It's a mechanism for us. We spoke early on about our sense of mortality. And with nations, even though we know that we're going to pass, we are going to die, we endow ourselves, our individuality, in that collective, which we deem as eternal, and can say to ourselves, well, maybe I will pass, I will die, but at least the people of Israel, right, the Jewish people, they will abide. Okay, and I gain by that a sense of almost symbolic immortality. Now, the problem arises, in my mind, when that collective itself seems to be under existential threat, which is the sense of many Israeli Jews. That the Jewish state, the state of Israel, is under existential threat. And I think in some ways for good reasons. Now, what do you do when that happens? What we often try to do in response to that sort of danger is we try to construct not just material infrastructure that will allow us to forestall those threats, but also a sense of righteousness, that we are right. And that's the morality of nations. That's the way that the mortality and the morality of nations entwine. Now, what I think that we have seen throughout the history of Zionism is an ongoing attempt to create legitimacy for that enterprise. What I think we see in the last generation, mainly under Netanyahu, is fatigue. A sense that perhaps it didn't work and it will never work because, again, the world is against us no matter what. And so what's even the point of searching for any sort of profound legitimacy? Let's just feel happy about ourselves. We are the victims of the world, eternal victims, and thus also eternal righteous in what we do. And let's leave aside all that effort to actually create legitimacy, to hold on to certain principle values that we hold as universal and also applicable to the Jewish people. Let's just bask ourselves in our sense of being so righteous, and thus can also avenge whatever happened to us upon others without caring too much about the repercussions, the moral and the practical of that.
It reminds me the way children view the world. When children are engaged in arguments, usually there's a tendency to come up with the argument that no one can really answer, right? The whole world is against us. That's a very immature, childish, and binary argument.
Right. I think that you pointed to a very important aspect of it, the binarism of it and the childish approach that is often entwined with that. The childish element you can see in the fact that we, I think, witness the rise of narcissism worldwide, certainly among the leadership, right? It's not really self-love, it's love of your own reflection. It's how you reflect yourself in the mirror and think that others can see you. And of course, social media plays a tremendous role in that. But the binarism aspect is even more fascinating. I call it chessification. Chessification in the sense that we chessify our mind to become almost like pieces on a chessboard. Typically, when you look at, if you look for websites of political science departments worldwide, often enough you will see an image of a chessboard. The argument being that basically politics is like playing chess, right? We are the players and we move the pieces strategically, rationally, smartly. We try to predict the other's move and counter them. What I think we increasingly see in our politics is that we don't play chess. We are played. And we see ourselves as pieces, often enough as just pawns that can readily sacrifice themselves for the greater cause. And part of chess is that perspective of binarism, right? It's either this or that, black or white. And it goes with a sense of belligerence, right? It's either us or them. There can be a place for both of us, right? It's a battle for life and death. And it's either that you're with us or against us. That is our enemy. All of that simplifies so much the sort of complex reality that we're a part of. And again, it's part of the human condition. Because freedom, I'm certainly not the first to say that, freedom is a great burden. Responsibility is a great burden. choice and responsibility. And what we've seen with our politicians, with our leaders, is relentlessly shirking choice and responsibility, not making a choice and dismissing the responsibility. They can only do that, however, if we allow them to do that. That's the legitimacy loop. You know, those leaders, those polities, those politicians, those parties are legitimate only because we see them as legitimate. If we stop doing that, they will lose all legitimacy. It's basically in our hands. And this, I think, is our task, to recreate legitimacy. By better realizing that, I think, source of the crisis of current liberal democracy, I think we can build a better political life. And to some extent, maybe even personal life, because it also infiltrates that aspect.
Well, you know, this is a fascinating conversation because you simplified so many complex issues in today's political life and political conversation. I wanted to thank you. You know, time is running out and we have to finish, unfortunately. But we would love to host you here again, Professor Abulof.
Sure.
And to hear from you more about perhaps your next book.
On the conflict.
On the conflict, absolutely. And again, thank you so much for educating us and enriching us on this highly complex and important issue. And to our listeners and viewers back home, goodbye from Tel Aviv until our next episode. Bye-bye.